Hello and welcome back to the Fall of the Roman Empire. My name is Nick Holmes and this is episode 14 called A New Type of Emperor. Now we're getting to what I think is one of the most exciting periods in all of Roman history. This was the Roman fight back against the barbarians in the crisis of the 3rd century. In the last few episodes you've heard about the empire's collapse under the weight of barbarian attacks in the west. From the east came the mailed horsemen of Sasanian Persia. From within, the empire's strength was sapped by civil war, mutinous armies and plague. It really was the fall before the fall. And one of the most surprising things is that it's a period that most people aren't even aware of. I think this is mainly because of the scarcity of reliable source material, which has prompted a lot of scholars to avoid it. So, just how did the Roman Empire survive? Well, in my opinion, it can be summed up in one word: revolution. For Rome reinvented itself, and the new Rome was politically, economically and culturally totally different from the ancient Rome that had received a mortal blow. Indeed, as we will discuss later, it even became Christian. And this was mainly due to a series of truly remarkable emperors who equalled the great Augustus in their ability to revitalise Rome. As the great historian Edward Gibbon, writing over 200 years ago, wrote, "Under the deplorable reigns of Valerian and Gallienus, the empire was oppressed and almost destroyed by the soldiers, the tyrants and the barbarians. It was saved by a series of great princes who derived their obscure origin from the martial provinces of Illyricum. Within a period of about 30 years, Claudius, Aurelian, Probus, Diocletian and his colleagues triumphed over the foreign and domestic enemies of the state, re-established with the military discipline the strength of the frontiers, and deserved the glorious title of restorers of the Roman world." So, without further ado, let's find out how the Romans beat the barbarians. In AD 268, the Roman army stationed in Mediolanum, or Milan as it's called today, did something that was to change the course of history. It declared a man called Claudius as the new emperor in succession to Gallienus. While Gallienus had come from one of Rome's most distinguished families, this new emperor was very different. His background was the exact opposite to that of the emperors over the last 250 years, for they had nearly all of them come from the aristocratic and privileged elite ruling class based in Rome. But Claudius came from a poor family in Illyria. That's the Roman term for modern Croatia, Bosnia, Serbia, south of the Danube. And he'd risen to prominence in the army as a prize wrestler, famous for knocking out his opponent's teeth. Indeed, he was reputed to have knocked out a horse's teeth with one punch. Of huge stature and strength, he was not just a formidable fighter, but a natural leader, as well as an astute military tactician. This was just what the Roman army needed. But how did it happen? The answer was a political revolution, for the major difference between Claudius and previous emperors was that ever since Augustus had made his pact with the Senate, there had been an unwritten rule that senators were entitled to the positions of power within the empire. While there had, of course, been many tensions between some emperors and the Senate, for example, from the mad emperors like Caligula and Nero, and even to Hadrian, who the Senate regarded as quasi-tyrannical, there had never been an emperor who denied senators the senior commands within the army and lucrative positions governing the provinces. Or that was the case up until the reign of Gallienus, for it was in fact Gallienus who had been responsible for breaking with this tradition and denying positions of power to men whose only qualification was that they were senators or aristocrats. Admittedly, he was continuing a trend that had established itself after Marcus Aurelius's reign, when the Senate enjoyed its last late imperial honeymoon, and after which growing external pressures from the Persians and Germans had forced the Severan emperors to look for more experienced soldiers and men who were not always just prominent senators. Yet it was Gallienus who, according to a Roman source, was, quote, the first to prohibit the senators from undertaking a military career or entering the army, end quote. In order to defeat the enemies battering down the gates and to preserve himself from the endless series of aristocratic pretenders to the throne, Gallienus chose men to command the army on merit alone. This was a revolution. It was also Gallienus's death warrant, for it was the same men that he promoted who killed him. Now let us return to that night in Gallienus's camp outside Milan, where we ended the last episode. You may remember that Gallienus was called away from his supper table under the ruse that the traitor Aureolus was making a night attack. Gallienus was then tricked into leaving his bodyguard, and while he donned his armour, he met the commander of the Dalmatian cavalry, Cecropius, who drove a sword into his guts. But who was really behind this? It was two men who would be the next two emperors, and who between them would save the Roman Empire. The first was Claudius, promoted to supreme Roman cavalry commander by Gallienus himself. Indeed, he was one of Gallienus's most trusted men. His was an example of promotion on merit, for which Gallienus had earned the hatred of the Senate. For Gallienus had the ability to pick men of talent like Claudius, but unlike, say, the French Emperor Napoleon, who was renowned for his ability to win absolute loyalty from his men, Gallienus failed to win anyone's loyalty. Perhaps it was true what the Augustan history said about him being a brave soldier, but an odious man. The second conspirator was Claudius's trusted sidekick Aurelian. Another cavalry commander, he would of course become one of the greatest of all the Roman emperors, known as the restorer of the world. But his day was still to come. For back in Milan, Gallienus had been killed by Cecropius, the commander of the Dalmatian cavalry, whose boss was Claudius. Claudius had been waiting for this moment, but he knew that seizing the imperial throne for someone like him was a novel experiment. Yes, the Roman army had proclaimed its own emperors many times, but they had always come from the senatorial class. He was the first emperor genuinely to come from the barracks, apart from the short-lived emperor Maximinus Thrace, who had briefly reigned for 3 years between AD 235 and 238, as the legion's appointed leader, ousting the last of the Severan dynasty, Severus Alexander. But Maximinus Thrace had been quickly overthrown and replaced by the more aristocratic Gordian family, and Claudius knew that he was taking a massive gamble in a world that was still dominated by aristocratic families. To start with, he might be criticised for Gallienus's death, for, despite Gallienus's dubious reputation for being a licentious maverick, more interested in poetry and seduction than government, he was surprisingly popular with the soldiers, who admired his bravery in battle and even the quirkiness of his private life. So, to keep them happy, Claudius paid them a large donative in gold. Rewarding the soldiers for their support was a long-established tradition, and of course Augustus had been careful to do this as well, but in the reign of the Severans it had taken a step further, with both Septimius Severus and his son Caracalla increasing army pay significantly. From Claudius's reign onwards, it now became the norm to pay the troops large donatives, normally in gold, on the accession of new emperors, and also as a reward for successful campaigns. His next task was to win over the Senate. Despite the fact that he was a man of humble origins, he was helped hugely by Gallienus's unpopularity with most senators. Because of this, the Senate had little hesitation in endorsing him. Indeed, in order to smooth the waters, perhaps again with his own soldiers in mind, and to distance himself from Gallienus's assassination, he persuaded the Senate to deify him. Deification had long been one of the few surviving prerogatives of the Senate. Good emperors were deified, bad ones like Commodus were not. Indeed, even Hadrian had offended the Senate sufficiently for them not to want to deify him, and his successor Antoninus Pius earned the epithet Pius for his efforts in persuading the Senate to change its mind. Claudius even turned on one of his own to expiate the sins of murdering Gallienus. Cecropius, the commander of the Dalmatian cavalry and Gallienus's actual assassin, disappeared, not just from his post, but also from history. Presumably to appease Gallienus's supporters, he was either banished or killed. However, his other co-conspirator, Aurelian, was rewarded. He assumed Claudius's previous position as commander of all the Roman cavalry. Claudius was the master of military expediency. He didn't mind how he won, so long as he won, and urgency was required. His first task was to dispose of the rebel Aureolus, still hiding behind the walls of Milan. This was quickly done. Within days, Aureolus was dead, either at the hands of his own men, who now wanted to join Claudius, or tricked into surrendering and subsequently executed. The next task was to protect Italy. The latest Roman civil war with Aureolus had prompted the Alemanni and their German neighbours, the Jutungi, to cross the upper Danube and to invade northern Italy in the first Germanic invasion of Italy since Gallienus had decisively defeated the Alemanni at the Battle of Mediolanum in 260. The threat was now just as grave as it had been then, but this was just the opportunity Claudius had been looking for to show his skill as a general. With Aurelian in command of the all-important Roman cavalry, he marched east to meet the Germans at Lake Garda in early 269. The result was a crushing Roman victory. The Germans retreated headlong back over the Danube. The grateful Senate named him Germanicus Maximus in honour of his victory. Next, it was the turn of the Goths. They had also benefited hugely from the Roman civil war between Gallienus and Aureolus. Gallienus had in fact inflicted a defeat on them at the Battle of Nessos on the Macedonian-Thracian border in the spring of 268. The defeat was sufficient for the Heruli, who were fighting with the Goths, to come to a separate agreement with Gallienus to evacuate Roman territory. But the moment Gallienus had left for Milan to crush Aureolus's rebellion, the Heruli broke the truce, and together with the Goths and Gepids, they launched an onslaught both by land and sea against northern Greece. According to the contemporary chronicler Zosimus, this second Gothic assault, which came 2 years after the first in 267, was huge, with supposedly 320,000 warriors, although that's clearly an exaggeration, and unnervingly for the Romans, an equally massive Heruli fleet said to have 2,000 ships. The Heruli fleet sailed through the Bosphorus and made an unsuccessful attack on Byzantium, which was of course the future Constantinople, before joining the Gothic land forces to besiege the great Roman city of Thessalonica, which is still today a very important city and Greece's second largest city after Athens. Initially, Claudius did not know what to do, for he'd also heard that in the west, Postumus's Gallic Empire was in serious trouble, offering him a potential opportunity to recover it. What had happened was that the Roman infighting had even spread to the Gallic Empire itself, with Postumus facing an uprising by one of his own generals, Lelian. Postumus engaged this rebel in battle and defeated and killed him, but dissension was so high within his own ranks that when he refused to allow his soldiers the right to sack Mainz, which is where Lelian had been based, they turned on him and killed him. Claudius now wondered whether this internecine warfare within the Gallic Empire might present him with an opportunity to intervene, and so he delayed heading east to deal with the Goths, instead sending Aurelian with a large cavalry unit to try to relieve Thessalonica. Aurelian's cavalry fought well, inflicting heavy casualties on the Goths in a succession of skirmishes. Claudius then decided to abandon any hopes of recovering Gaul and marched east to join Aurelian. The Goths abandoned the siege of Thessalonica and cornered between Aurelian's cavalry and Claudius's advancing army. A bloody battle was fought at Naissus in 269 in northern Greece. This battle proved to be the turning point of the 3rd century. According to the Roman sources, Claudius tricked the main Gothic army into an ambush by pretending to retreat. His soldiers then surrounded and massacred a large part of the Gothic army, apparently with up to 50,000 Gothic dead. Claudius had won his greatest victory. Winston Churchill said of the Battle of El Alamein in 1942 that, quote, "Before Alamein we never had a victory. After Alamein we never had a defeat," end quote. The same could be said for the Romans of the Battle of Naissus, for at least in the context of the 3rd century crisis, there had until then only been a string of Roman defeats. After this battle, although there was still a long war to be fought to reunite the empire, the Romans would win almost every battle. The tide had turned. But the Goths were not finished yet. They retreated back through Thrace. Aurelian nearly trapped them at Mount Haemus, but they managed to break out and wound their way back to the Danube. Meanwhile, the Roman navy, operating out of Egypt under the command of the prefect of Egypt, Tenagino Probus, successfully defeated and contained the Heruli fleet, which had accompanied the Goths. The sources are very vague, but it seems that while the Goths were fighting on land, the Heruli ravaged the Aegean islands, including both Crete and Cyprus. However, it appears that the Roman fleet scored a victory against them in the Aegean, and like the retreating Goths, they fled also back home to the Black Sea. So the great Gothic Heruli invasion had been defeated. Rome celebrated, and Claudius was honoured with yet another title by the Senate in recognition of his victory, Gothicus Maximus. For centuries afterwards, and indeed until this day, he would best be remembered as Claudius Gothicus, the man who had defeated the Goths. But another factor had undoubtedly played a crucial role in his victory, and one that he was also to fall victim to. And this was plague. For there's no doubt that the Goths were suffering from a devastating plague that swept through the Balkans during the spring and summer of 270, and may have been related to the plague of Cyprian, although most historians think that that did in fact finish a little bit earlier. And it affected the Roman army as well, and just as the Roman fight back against the barbarians was beginning, it struck down Claudius himself. He died from the plague in August 270 in Sirmium, a Roman city south of the Danube in modern-day Serbia. Claudius's second in command, Aurelian, took over from him. Aurelian's exploits would greatly surpass Claudius's, and he would become known not just as Germanicus or Gothicus, but as the restorer of the world. And that ends this episode. Thanks so much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it. And as usual, if you did, I'd be really grateful if you wanted to subscribe, tell a friend, or best of all, to leave a review on Apple Podcasts or whatever podcast app you use, or a rating on Spotify. That would be fantastic. Thank you very much. And in the next episode, before we move to Aurelian's epic restoration of the Roman Empire, we need to look at why the Roman army was suddenly winning victories in the late 260s. Because in the 250s, as you know, it had suffered defeat after defeat. So what had changed? Let's find out in the next episode. See you then.